So I'm going to really quickly try to give you a picture of the way we're working many different organizations to integrate how we think about meadows, how we prioritize meadow work, and how we bring science into meadow restoration across California. Jeanette Howard said to me earlier, she was like, meadows are like the new black, and it's really true. It's like everybody's super hyped on meadows, which is a great thing. It means that, you know, all of a sudden there's a fire hose of money pointed at meadow restoration. But, you know, when you try to fill a cup with a fire hose, you waste water. Sometimes you knock the cup out of your hand. It doesn't always work the way that you intended. So we're hoping to actually create a little structure in the way that we think about meadows and approach them in order to facilitate doing a better job with the resources that are available right now and better outcomes in the way that Karen was alluding to the need for. So from a context perspective, in the last 10 years, a lot more people paying attention to the need, opportunity of meadow restoration. In the last 5 years, a lot more coordination. In the last couple years, some really big, new, robust data sets like the one Jeanette told you about. And in the last 1 year, we've had, you know, in the last 10 years, progressively more funding, but like the curve just took a precipitous bend upwards in the last year. So that's kind of the context, you know, that we're dealing with, and, you know, also as Karen alluded to, trying not to let the excitement sort of outstrip our organization. And so this context creates a lot of needs or opportunities. You know, there's an opportunity to work together to do structured decision making, like some of the stuff that we were talking about earlier related to meadows. There's the opportunity to incorporate multiple focus points. So unlike most of our conservation, which happens with a very species-centric focus, meadows is about this habitat type, and it creates a new dynamic where it's like, oh, if we're focused on restoring meadows for hydrology, for water, what things get missed when we're not paying attention to species, and how do we bring these multiple foci into a more structured approach to meadow restoration? And then how do we design actions to achieve multiple objectives and also bring funding pools together to be able to fund big efforts to achieve multiple objectives? And it's really important with things like carbon, where the whole, you know, in some way, restoration as a concept still guides a lot of what we do. Like, even though we understand things can't be the way they were, we're still sort of trying to put them back the way they were. But with carbon, it's not necessarily the case, because the intent is often on sequestering carbon, not necessarily on sequestering carbon using functionality that existed historically. And in wetlands in the valley, we're already running into that as a potential issue, where people are like, don't flood, you know, rice fields for carbon sequestration, and other people are, you know, for greenhouse gas emission. Other people are like, wait a minute, we want the rice fields flooded. Those are good for fish and waterfowl. So in the meadow world, we're trying to get ahead of that a little bit by thinking about how does carbon actually get sequestered, how do species use meadows, and how do we use science to bring all those things together. And in order to do that, you know, we really need the application of quantitative methodologies, not only in the monitoring side, but in the designing of measurable objectives that we're trying to achieve through meadow restoration, and that guide our adaptive management. So the approach is really, it's really kind of straightforward in concept, but it's very difficult to apply to, like, you know, the unwieldy morass of people and bureaucracies that appear and get created when there's a huge amount of money out there around some topic area. But it's basically identify what the needs are, select and prioritize specific locations, and then design projects to achieve multiple benefits across the range of needs that you have, like fish, birds, carbon, meadow function. So it sounds, you know, so nice and easy. And here's a little flow chart of it. So basically what I'm going to try to do is, from my more fishy perspective, take you through how we start with high-level watershed data and then relate that to site selection, prioritization, bring in local data, goals and objectives, bring in local level project assessment, and then ask ourselves a bunch of questions about alignment and feasibility to get to a project that is implementable on the ground in the remaining 6 minutes or whatever I have left. So we start with needs and opportunities and using, geographic data, geospatial data related to, at the watershed scale, to identify where opportunities are and where different areas, management opportunities, management priorities are. And we have a bunch of tools now that we can use to do that. We have the freshwater species database, which we like to call Aquarius, and I like to think this is the dawning of a new age where we actually incorporate these things into our decision making. We have meadow-specific limiting factors tools like the Mr. Fat one we developed 5 years ago for fish, the Conservation Success Index, which is now for all freshwater species, and we have efforts like the Freshwater Conservation Blueprint that really assess watershed condition and relate that to aquatic species data for all of California. So we've got good information to bring to assessment of watershed and species condition. So you're supposed to, yeah, exactly. I think I see Jerry Garcia's face in there somewhere. And the point of this is the data set on meadows with native trout and their watershed condition in California from the Freshwater Conservation Blueprint effort. So this is just to give you a sense of that. We can take all of this watershed level geospatial data and use it to actually rank and prioritize where meadows and native trout overlap in California as a starting point. And then we can go through a bunch of steps where we begin by isolating those watersheds. We review indicators for watershed health. We select high priority watersheds, and then we can think about those priorities in different ways. So if it's vulnerable and has low health, that's a place we want to restore. If it's vulnerable and has high health, that's a place where we want to mitigate whatever's creating the vulnerability to create the health, to preserve the health. If it has high health and low vulnerability, you want to protect it. And if it has low health and low vulnerability, then you want to restore and mitigate. And then we can look at the limiting factors for fish and think, okay, where can the limiting factors for fish be alleviated by meadow restoration? And then that can guide where we do fish meadow projects. So here's what that spreadsheet looks like for native trout. It allows us to sort of parse watersheds in California based on watershed condition for native trout species and rank them. And we can do vulnerability, and then we can end up with the appropriate response along those axes that I was just describing across the range of native trout to guide sort of what flavor of management actions are appropriate. So the products that we get out of that effort are high priority meadow restoration sites, other high priority needs for fish that don't align with meadows but that are addressing their limiting factors, and then vulnerable meadows with low meadow restoration nexus with fish. So those are areas where those meadows are still important, but it's not areas where we want to use the fish lens to get at meadow functionality. And I'll just, as an aside, say that I'm giving you the fish version, but the power in this is that there are groups doing this for many different categories of species. And so you end up triangulating in on, it's like through all those different lenses, you see what a functional meadow actually looks like, as opposed to just using one of the lenses. So here's what that looks like just for Lahontan cutthroat trout. And here's sort of the integration. So, this is our process for fish. It gives you things that are good fish meadow and other, fish priorities that don't relate to meadows. And then you can merge that in with other species to get to meadow restoration opportunities that are good for multiple species, and then other opportunities that are good for those species that don't have to do with meadows. And then once you do that, you have this suite of opportunities in different categories, and you have to prioritize them. So that's where structured quantitative goals and objectives come in. It's where you also can bring in project or sort of focused landscape scale assessment techniques. There are, like, American Rivers has developed a meadow restoration scorecard for sort of rapid meadow assessment. You can do threats assessments, and then you can also, based on all of those things, develop restoration or remediation opportunities. So in the Kern drainage, where the Kern River Rainbow, California golden trout are, you can see most of this is green because most of the meadows are on Forest Service land, and they're somewhat impacted, but mainly they just need to be protected. They're not as impacted as things like in the lower watershed. The limiting factors for those fish species, the one that appears in all the different categories, is climate change, and the response metric is really about functional stream miles. So you want to, protect those stream miles that they're already in because they have very small ranges and they're going to get squeezed by climate. So then, that gives us the opportunity to, within that area, do some further prioritization. So here's the meadows. In black are the meadows that have golden trout. You can add in the meadow condition based on information you get from the American River Scorecard, for example, or from other on-the-ground science, stream habitat assessment. And then in the course of doing that assessment, you can find out where are the vulnerabilities, where are the head cuts in the meadows, how many meadows have head cuts, what's the area of the meadow related to the head cut, so how vulnerable are these meadows to losing more? Have most of them been converted already, or is there really something to save there? And then based on that, you can arrive at your high priority meadows where everybody agrees this is one we can say is important for the species. There's the opportunity to protect it, and when in doing that work, you're going to end up saving a lot of the meadow as opposed to just a little. And one of the really nice things, most of the people working in restoration are already doing some portion of this or several of these steps, but by having this conversation together, we also make transparent to our funders how we're thinking. Their thinking aligns with ours, and it becomes very easy for us to be working together and not battling each other, everyone trying to convince the same funder that their project is the most important, and instead really getting our projects to synergize with each other for a bigger overall effect. And then once you've done that, you mainly just have to ask yourself some key questions. So, like, are you aligned with the umpteen plans that are out there? And these are really important questions because the funders care about them, the planning agencies care about them, and if you're not in alignment with them, then you're undermining that whole synergy potential. And then also, do you have all the right partners, and have you gotten all the necessary approval? And as we learn to work together, one of the things, the onus is that's on all of us, is to educate ourselves about who's already out there doing work and do that outreach so that the process is becoming more inclusive and more collaborative, and we're breaking down some of those positionality, some of that positionality that existed in the past. And that's it. So this is work that a lot of people have been doing together for a number of years, but that's finally sort of coming together in a way that I'm hoping will help us outstrip that eagerness that Karen was talking about around just getting out on the ground and doing something, and instead allow us to kind of bring to bear all the information that we have to do things that are more integrated and more constructive in the long term. Thank you.